Now, finally, we're going to look at the last market structure called oligopoly. Oligopolistic markets are actually very important, and they're all around us. As we'll see, the analysis of them can be rather complex. So we're just going to touch on some very basic ideas. And if you're interested in this stuff, we've got a third-year course that looks at this in some detail. Let's just briefly review the characteristics of oligopolistic markets. As you'll probably remember, the idea of an oligopoly is that we've got just a few firms in the market. That's what this prefix oli means, or oligo. So if you have an oligopsony, that was a term we saw earlier, that meant that there were just a few large employers in a market, or a few large buyers. This means that there's just a few large sellers. However, it doesn't mean that they're the only ones in the market. It just means that a few large firms dominate the market. I'll give you an example in a minute in which we could also have some smaller firms, but they're much smaller than the big ones. A key feature of this kind of market is that these firms are very interdependent. So if one firm makes a strategic decision, the other ones are going to notice. They're going to be affected, and they're going to have to think about whether they're going to respond, whether they're going to do anything in response to the other firm's action. So we could imagine all kinds of actions that could lead to these kinds of strategic situations. A firm could change its price. It could open up a new location somewhere. It could carry out some research and development and modify the nature of its product and therefore affect its competitors. So there's all kinds of complicated situations that one could examine. An important feature of this market, if we're going to have just a few large firms, is that it must be difficult to enter this industry and to become large yourself. So we would describe this as saying that there's relatively high barriers to entry. Not extremely high, as in the case of monopoly, which kept there being just a single firm in the market, but this is in contrast to the idea of a competitive market or a monopolistically competitive market that we looked at earlier, where barriers to entry were effectively very low. Where do such barriers come from? Well, one possibility would be that you would need a lot of capital in order to enter this market. So it might be difficult to raise the funds to do that. It may be that existing firms are very powerful. Maybe they're very well known. They've got loyal customers. If you're going to enter this market, you have to pry some of those customers away from them, and that may not be so easy. The existing firms may make it even more difficult by fighting back against you, so maybe they will cut prices. The term predatory pricing is used in your textbook. That means cutting prices in a way that's intended to drive the competition, the competing firm, literally out of the market. I'll just give you a couple of examples of markets that could be classified as oligopolistic. I looked up some information about media advertising revenues in Canada. The most recent data available is for 2018. Now the print is rather small here, but if you have a look at it, you won't be too surprised to see that Google and Facebook have the largest media advertising dollars in Canada. If we look at their share of the market in 2018, Google's at 27.5% was the largest. Facebook was about half that size at 14.7%. Then Bell Media at 11%, and then it drops off really quickly from there. One way to measure just how big the largest firms are is to look at what's called a concentration ratio. So that's what this CR down here stands for. So CR4 means the share of the market that's held by the largest 4 firms. So if we have a look at that here, the concentration ratio for the 4 largest firms is just under 60%. And then you can group a larger number of firms in it. If you look at the top 10, we're at about 76%. So this is a market that could be described as an oligopoly, although the largest 2 firms are not all that big. They're not completely dominating the market. Let's look at another example. I looked up data on telecommunications companies in Canada. So this is a picture which shows the largest companies, and on the horizontal axis we've got their revenue, their annual revenue in 2018 in millions of dollars. And this is kind of a fancy graph because what it does is it breaks that revenue down according to different sources, from providing wireless access to internet access, and radio and many other things. So you can see that among telecommunications companies, there's a few really big ones. Bell Media is by far the biggest, followed by Rogers and TELUS, and then Shaw Communications, significantly smaller, but those are the big 4. Now, you might think that grouping all of these sources of revenue together is really just adding up what's going on in many different markets. And indeed, to some extent, that's true. So if you want to, say, just look at the market for internet access that's shown by this sort of light turquoise bar, you can see how big Bell is compared with Rogers, compared with TELUS, and compared with Shaw. And so you can get some sense of who the big players are in those smaller markets. I mentioned earlier that one of the key features of an oligopoly like this is that the decisions that are made by one firm are going to be noticed by the other firms, and they can decide whether to respond or not. I saw in the news just today or yesterday that Bell is going ahead with increasing its prices for internet access, which is not very popular at this particular time. Rogers has decided not to increase its prices. So I don't know what Bell is thinking. They may be thinking that at this particular time, if people decide that they're mad at Bell, it's not going to be easy to switch to Rogers. Well, what I want to do now is to go and look at a very simple model of interdependence between firms. And I'm going to start off by telling the story of this particular British game show called Golden Balls. And I put a link to this particular episode on our D2L site. So I do urge you to watch it. It has some entertainment value. But let me just give you a brief description. Towards the end of this game, a lot of money has been accumulated and is sort of, so to speak, sitting on the table. We can't see them too clearly here, but there's a couple of gold-colored balls that sit on the table. And let me just describe their function. At the end of the game, each of the players, I'll just call them him and her, have a choice of which of these balls to choose. And inside the ball is written a word, either split or steal. Now, in this particular game that they just played, the amount of money on the table is £20,375, which is quite a lot of money. So the question is going to be which of these balls are each of these players going to choose. So as is explained in the video, what happens is that each one secretly selects one of them that has one of these strategies in it. So a strategy is the choice of which ball to pick. And then at the time announced by the host, each reveals the strategy that they've chosen to the other player. So let's just run through the possible outcomes. So this is the total amount of money on the table, the £20,375. If each of them chooses the ball that has the word split in it, then they split that total, and each one gets to go home with that much money, £10,187.50. On the other hand, if he chooses the steal ball and she chooses the split ball, she gets nothing and he gets everything. He steals it, in effect. And it's symmetric, so if he were to choose split and she chooses steal, he gets nothing and she gets everything. And if they both try to steal the amount, they end up with nothing. So, how do we think about that kind of situation? What kind of incentive do these individuals have? Well, let's think about it just from his point of view. He can think, if she chooses split, which one is best for me? Well, if he chooses split, he ends up with £10,000. If he chooses steal, he ends up with £20,000. So choosing steal is clearly better for him if she chooses to split. And of course, if she chooses the steal ball, then he might as well choose steal as well, because he's getting nothing out of this in any event. So it would be safer for him to choose the steal ball in case she chooses split. So here, he's not better off one way or the other. We're assuming he doesn't care about her, so he's not going to be happy if she takes that £20,000 home. So the strategy that's going to come to his mind is to choose the steal ball. And of course, she's going to be thinking the same way. But of course, if they both do that, then they get nothing. So that's the key problem in this kind of situation. Obviously, they can't cooperate with each other. They have an incentive to choose the steal ball, but clearly they would be better off if they chose the split. Well, let's translate this particular story into a story about a business firm.